We are continuing in the book of Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiastes chapter number 2. Now, because the author of Ecclesiastes really builds upon his themes throughout this book, if you haven't listened to the previous sermon, I do encourage you to go online and see how this author starts this book of Ecclesiastes, because it's one consistent thought from beginning all the way to the end. So, in this, he has already laid out that everything in this world, everything under the sun, is vanity. It's pointlessness. It's uselessness. It has no meaning behind any of it. Everything in this world comes to an end. It has no permanence. It's like chasing after the wind. It's like a vapor that you try to grasp, but it just floats away. Well, now he's going to go through systematically and try to see, can I find meaning in any of these other things? Can I go through all the experiences in this life, and maybe there I can find something that isn't just striving after wind, something that's solid, that's concrete, that I can build my life around? Well, he goes to something that's very popular and common. He first considers the idea of pleasure. Could we find purpose? We have desires, we have goals and dreams, we have urges. Can we find purpose and meaning in life in the fulfillment of pleasure? Now, the Bible actually has a lot to say about pleasure, and unlike what many may characterize the Bible as, the Bible is actually very pro-pleasure. You can all turn to the book of the Song of Solomon to see a very pleasurable kind of book. All throughout the Bible, even feasting is something that is sometimes required of God's people, and so food and pleasure there isn't something that the Bible is against. But we have to keep pleasure in perspective, because not all pleasure is going to lead us, or any pleasure ultimately, to satisfaction. Throughout the history of mankind, other philosophers have wrestled with this idea. And even in today, we see that the predominant thing that people want to dive themselves into isn't the big existential questions. They just think, if I can get enough pleasure in my life so that I can dull the constant nagging of my heart, the emptiness that I feel, if I can fill all my emptiness with pleasure, maybe then I'll finally be happy. We have tons of things on social media and Twitter and TikTok and Instagram, all to prove to everybody else how much pleasure you're having, even though inside you may be miserable. Well, human beings throughout all of time have thought maybe pleasure is the key to human life and happiness. The Stoics were those of ancient Greece that said, well, the problem is, because they recognized that there was suffering in the world, that maybe the answer is not desiring something. They kind of took the Buddhist answer for things, that instead of desiring something, if you have no desires, well then, you have nothing to be sorry for. You have nothing to feel bad about. You give up all of the desires of this world. But others came along and said, no, that's not quite right, because if all you do is keep on denying yourself of any kind of pleasure and any kind of thing, you just turn into a miserable person. And that's why we have the phrase now that someone's very stoic, they're a very dour kind of person, because that's what the Stoics produced. So along with this, we had the hedonists. And they said, no, see, you are trying to go against all pleasure, and instead the Greek hedonists said you need to get as much pleasure as you possibly can. So you're going to take the Fred's approach to pleasure. If any of you don't know about Fred's Market, it's an all-you-can-eat buffet of country food, and you always leave there a little bit feeling worse than when you came because you eat way too much. Well, the hedonists were the Fred's kind of philosophy of just get as much as you can from life. Stuff your face with everything you possibly can. Get all the drink you can. Get all the pleasure you can. As much of it you can, as often as you can. Well, the problem is, just like Fred's teaches us, you eat too much, you start to feel bad. And so your pleasure meter starts to go down. And so simply getting as much as you possibly can also isn't the answer. And this isn't Bible, this is just human beings trying to work out, does pleasure have any merit in our lives for meaning? And so there came along these called the Epicureans. And these were those also of ancient Greece that said, well, because overeating can cause pain, therefore, it's not getting as much as you can that's the meaning of life. Rather, the meaning of life is avoiding the pain. And so, if you've ever read a cookbook and they talk about Epicurean values, it's those that rather want the finest. So I'm not going to get as much wine as I possibly can. I'm not going to get the box wine. Instead, I'm going to get the highest Chateau Bordeaux, whatever Frenchy kind of thing we can talk about, and that's what I'm going to use. I'm not going to just get as much food as I can. I'm going to get the finest food. I'm going to get the caviar. And I'm not going to have tons of it. I'm just going to have a little bit of it that's very nice and fine. What's interesting is that all of these philosophies we actually saw in the book of Acts, and they all opposed the Apostle Paul. None of these philosophies encapsulates what God actually says, the meaning and perspective on pleasure that we ought to have. So let us turn to the book of Ecclesiastes and see how should we as Christians view pleasure in relation to the meaning of life. He says in verse number 1 of chapter 2, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this was all vanity. I said to laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart to know cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under the heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forests of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves that were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the children of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom returned to me. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered that all my hands had done, and the toil that I had expended in doing it, and behold, all of it was vanity, and a striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. And what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has been done. Then I saw that this is more gain in wisdom than there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceived that the same event happens to them all. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity. For of the wise as of the fool there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and striving after wind. I hated all my toil, in which I toiled under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who comes after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will be master of all which I have toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned about the grave, gave my heart to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun. Because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is of the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to the one who pleases God. This also is vanity and striving after the wind. So, once again, we have another heavy passage to go through on Sunday morning. The first thing that we need to see, and we see this in verses 1 through 11, is that building for pleasure doesn't satisfy. If you take pleasure as your ultimate goal and what you build your entire life around, that is not going to give you satisfaction. Forget about meaning in life. Forgetting out about ultimate purpose, not even satisfaction will it give you. So he said that I'm going to run an experiment. I'm going to test with my life as much pleasurable things as I possibly can and see if that ultimately leads to meaning, to this existential crisis that I'm having. So he goes to verse number 3, cheer my body with wine, even though, he says, my heart's still guiding me with wisdom. He's not doing this to reckless abandon. He's saying, I'm actually going to put an experiment before me and see if this satisfies. So he confines himself to find meaning in only what he can see and touch and feel. If that's all there is, under the sun, so we're not talking about eternal things, we're not talking about heaven. If under heaven, this is all that matters, what I can feel and touch and experience, can I find meaning there? All of the direct observation that I can have of life, all of the physical experience humans are capable of, he's going to go down that road and see, can I find ultimate satisfaction? What he's doing here is he's creating a secular Garden of Eden, where he can find all the pleasures he possibly can that ultimately should only come from God. So, when we look at him and what he builds here, this sounds like a success. If you're going to say this is a successful life, what does he do? What pleasures does he pursue? We have about 11 things here. He has wine, first of all, so he pursues pleasure in wine. 2, he has constructions of great projects, so he's actually productive. He's actually trying to improve the society and the landscape around him. He's not just hoarding it all up for himself. And surely, in serving others and building up things, there's a measure of pleasure that's there. He builds houses. He plants vineyards. He makes gardens and parks, these public works. He plants entire orchards. He made pools for use of irrigation of entire forests. He has no lack of resources to build all these things. He had multiple people to care for his every whim and need. He had more livestock than anyone else around him. And you know what that translates to? It translates to meat, which is something that is of a delicacy. He accumulates massive wealth. He had full-time singers and musicians for his entertainment whenever he wanted. Back then, there wasn't Alexa, play the music for me. He had a band. And when he wanted that band to play, he would ask them to play something. He even had something that would make us blush, a harem of women to indulge himself in. Every single thing his eye desired and wanted, he pursued it and obtained it. Now, many would look at that and say, well, that sounds like a successful life. For Koheleth, the author, it's a failure. He says this is striving after the wind. This is vanity. This is useless. This is grasping after wind. It's as solid as smoke. We see this even around us as morality tales, as we see so many of the celebrity class who get all the riches, all the fame, all the fortune, and then destroy their lives in drugs and in scandal. Because all those things don't bring fulfillment. They don't answer the real need of your soul. Sometimes we can think, man, all of life is just trying to make myself happy, and if I just had this one thing, and our society's built that way. That's what commercials are, trying to trick you into thinking that if you just had this one thing, all of your life would come to completion. If you just had the degree, or if you just had the car, or if you just had the bottle of Coca-Cola, then everything in your life is going to be pleasurable. Sometimes I see my children play this very obscure game called Minecraft. Ever heard of Minecraft? Minecraft, if you're not aware, is kind of like a computer video game version of Legos. You can do anything you want. You can build anything you want. And in there's 2 different modes. There's a survival mode where you have life and got to do things. And then there's the creative mode where you can just build anything you want. You can make whatever structures you want, and any kind of rivers or mountains or castles or cathedrals. In the world of Minecraft, there is a Reformation church, and it is amazing. And sometimes you think, man, what would life be like if I could have Minecraft creative mode in real life? If I could, anything my heart desired and dreamed I could build, any edifice that I wanted, any kind of piece of technology or palace or kingdom, man, that would be the life. Well, what this passage tells us is that even if you had the magic of Minecraft created mode in real life, it would still be a failure. It'd still be vanity. It still would not answer the very deep longing of your soul. Building for pleasure doesn't satisfy you. The next thing we see is that building for pleasure, making your whole life about pleasure, it all ends when you die. It has an expiration date on it. We see this in verses 12 through 19. And so he says, he thinks about wisdom and folly, and he does have to tip the hat to wisdom, because wisdom is better, just as light is better than darkness, and so in that it has it. However, both the wise and the foolish still die. Even if you pride yourself in being clever, which is a little bit different than wisdom, of how smart you can be, you're still going to die as much as the stupid person's going to die. You're still going to end up in the same grave. So, past what this author does, he tries to drive us down to the real question of why. Past all of our superficial answers that we give so that our hearts can avoid the real question. We hope to be distracted enough, intoxicated enough, not just with wine, but also with the acceptance of this world and the things of this world, to avoid the real answer regarding the meaning of life. In verse 15, he points out that what happens to the wise also happens to the fool. This author has the intelligence to remember that wisdom and folly are abstractions, concepts. We are real men and women, real people. So it is little use commending us to the ultimate worth of wisdom if in the end none of us will be around to exercise wisdom or to even value it or know it when we're dead. If one fate comes to all, and that fate is extinction, it robs every man of his dignity, and every project we may put ourselves to, it robs it of its point. As I said last week, if this life is all that matters, then nothing ultimately matters. If death comes to all, and if the end of the road is death, then any value judgments about anything that we say is important, even what we think is good or bad, wise or foolish, loving or hateful, moral or immoral, if this life is all there is, all of that is irrelevant. Our life is a vapor, here for a short while, and then it fades away. If all that there is what's under the sun. So, last point. Not only is building for pleasure doesn't satisfy, not only building for pleasure ends when you die, but building for pleasure is wasted by those who come after you. You say, okay, well, my purpose, my meaning is to build a life so that I can pass something on to my kids. I can give an inheritance to them. I can make life for my family better. Well, what happens to those who build up much things for their life if they're wise? Those who come after them, their children, may be foolish and squander away everything that was gained. And yet, we have to realize, verse number 24, he says there's nothing better for a person that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil, and this I saw is from the hand of God. So the author here of Ecclesiastes is not anti-pleasure. What he's trying to do is put pleasure in its proper perspective. how we should rightly understand pleasure. Not in a hedonistic, get everything I can, not in an Epicurean trying to find my meaning in pleasure, not in a stoicism of shunning all pleasure, but how we should properly understand it. Finding meaning from our accomplishments on this earth alone has no meaning. However, the very work that may have a danger of enslaving us, if you derive your worth from it, can provide pleasure if properly in perspective. Not in the accumulation of grand success, but in the mindfulness of simple joys. So, he looked at all of these great public works he did, forests, mountains, buildings, palaces, and that didn't give him pleasure, but his toil and a good meal at the end of the day, that, he said, is a gift from God. That is where he derived more pleasure than all the mountains and palaces and riches that he accumulated. Now, in our country, we have industrialized food. It's like a factory that goes through. And so we often do not respect the pleasure that it can give. Merely seeing it as yet another of our over-bloated commodities in which we consume and use up as one would a Post-it note or disposable pens or disposable cups or disposable razors or any of the other disposable things we throw in the garbage. We have no respect for food anymore, as if it has a second thought in our brain. Connecting food to labor, even if the connection isn't directly by our hands but in our minds, lets us appreciate the good pleasure of food as it was intended. There's pleasure even in the labor. Almost every single pastor I know, because a lot of pastoral work is unseen spiritual things that you can't quite tell if, where people are and if they're growing or receding, that sort of thing spiritually. Every single pastor friend I know loves mowing their grass. Because when you go on your riding mower and you mow your grass, you have something at the end of the day you can look at and say, there, I've done it. And you kind of just take a moment of pleasure to look at the mowed grass, as if you accomplished something. I've exercised dominion over the weeds. Well, this is exactly what the book of Ecclesiastes is saying. In that simple pleasure, that's where you find joy and contentment. Many of us see the acts of eating food as something merely to keep our bodies going or something to consume as a commodity. What we need to do is stop and slow down in our life. Many of us act like we are soldiers on the battlefield, eating MREs in the middle of war, needing to get our sustenance as fast as we can because we're always on the go and always have something more to do. We aren't meant to live constantly that way. Think about what you're doing while you're eating. Lunch is more than just sustenance. It's a moment to meditate on God's gift to you. If you think this is trivial, you're just talking about paying attention while you're eating your food. This book, Ecclesiastes, is about ultimate meaning of life and death and eternity and the grand philosophy of existence itself. And this is one of the first and few positive things the author has to say about this life. There's something important here he's trying to get across. Stop living just to strive, work, and wear yourself out, because one day, all you're going to be is dust. Rather, engage in the human experience, and that includes working so that you may enjoy living the life that God has given you. You ever eat a fresh, juicy, ripe, raw tomato? Maybe just with a little bit of salt on it as you bite into its juiciness. The simplicity of the flavor, and yet how delicious it is. Now, when I'm doing that, when I'm biting into that ripe, juicy, raw, red tomato with a little bit of salt on it, I'm not thinking about spreadsheets. I'm not thinking about taxes. I'm thinking, good tomato. My point is, too often we live like we're zombies in this world, moving around doing functions, but we aren't really alive. What Ecclesiastes gives us is an invitation to be human again. And while we live in a fallen world in which we work by the sweat of our brow, when we can learn to take pleasure in the small joys, that they are a gift from God, we learn to be truly human again. So the problem isn't the pleasure in themselves. It is our trying to get more out of them than they can ever give us. Fulfillment, significance, and meaning cannot be found in pleasure. They can only be found in God. So notice these spiritual gifts that he gives them in verse number 26. God gives spiritual gifts. He gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy to those who please him. Intangible things. They may not be mansions. They may not be flowing rivers and orchards. So while the sinner strives all their life gathering and collecting only to lose everything they gained in the end, this question is for you. What do you see as more valuable? God's wisdom, knowledge, and joy? Or all these things of this world? All the mansions, all the quote-unquote financial security, or wisdom, knowledge, and joy from God? Do you want to focus on the gathering and collecting of things so that you can vanish away all of your accomplishments after you've gone? Jesus actually taught about this same concept, exact same concept, in Luke chapter number 12, verse 15, and we'll close with this. Jesus said, and he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." I think in our age, that's worth repeating. Life does not consist in the abundance of your possessions. And he told them a parable saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops." And he thought to himself, verse 18, and he said, "I will do this. I will tear down my barns and I'll build larger ones. And there I'll store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry." But God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" Just like Ecclesiastes, passed on to another. Jesus ends his parable by saying this, "So is the one who lays up treasure for himself, but is not rich towards God." So that's the question this morning. Are you seeking to be rich in this world or rich towards God? And how are you rich towards God? Well, he gives these gifts of wisdom, knowledge, and joy in Ecclesiastes. You who are parents, I ask this also of you. You think of passing down to your children all kinds of financial things. Are you passing on to them what makes them rich towards God? Knowledge, joy, and wisdom from God? Or just stuff that you're given to them? So how does one become rich towards God? Ephesians 2, 6 through 7 talks about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And because of that, we have been given immeasurable riches. Because of what Jesus Christ did on the cross, he has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in heavenly places. This is why we come to the Lord's Supper, to remember what he did for us. That even our striving after the wind, even our covetousness, where we tried to follow after the things of this world, he took that upon himself on the cross and died for those things. So that we could find true significance and meaning in our life. So he could bless us, so that we can be rich towards God and not with the poverty of this world. So as we come before the Lord's Supper, dwell on the richness he offers to you. If you do not know Jesus as your Lord and Savior, you are truly impoverished. You may be rich in this world, get all the dreams you can possibly have, and yet you are spiritually destitute. Come to him today. Accept him as your Lord and Savior and be rich in him. Find ultimate meaning, the satisfaction of your soul in Jesus Christ. Let's pray. Our great God, we thank you that you have given us this meaning, that things in this life will all pass away, but all those things where we are rich in you, they stand forever. And so, Lord, help us to be thankful, not covetous of the things of this world, but thankful for the riches that you generously give us. In Christ's name, amen. At this time, we're going to have